Well, everyone, this is Seraphim Hamilton, and today we are back with Ken Griffith to continue to discuss the history of the ancient world as it relates to the history of the Bible. Before we get into today's discussion, I just want to say that I published a series of essays on Amazon called Christ in All Things, Essays in Scripture and Theology. And you can get that in the link that is pinned in the first comment you see in the comment section below. So Ken Griffith and Darrell White have co-authored a series of papers called The Chronological Framework of Ancient History, which are being published in the Answers Research Journal. This model of ancient history seeks to reconcile ancient history of the surrounding kingdoms of Israel with the Bible. Ken has agreed to a series of interviews to discuss this new research. This is episode 6 in this series. You can get the overview in episode 1, and links to Ken's master chart for ancient history and his papers can be found in the description of this video. So Ken, thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Seraphim. It's a pleasure.
So following up from our last discussion, I want to ask you a couple of additional questions about Shishak, the king of Egypt. So for those who aren't familiar with this narrative from memory, in First Kings, after the division of the northern kingdom under Jeroboam and the southern kingdom under Solomon's son Rehoboam, there is a Pharaoh of Egypt who's named as Shishak, and he comes up against Jerusalem and he robs the temple of Solomon. So this figure has been a major point of contention between conventional historians and revisionist historians who have various ideas about who precisely, in Egyptian terms, Shishak, the king of Egypt, is. So Ken, you've identified Shishak with Thutmose III of the 18th dynasty. So I have a couple things on this. First, is there an Egyptian record of this campaign? And second, for those who are a little more familiar with the internal debate among revisionists, I'm really interested to know what you think about the debate between Emmanuel Velikovsky and Eva Daniels's interpretation of the relationship between Shishak's campaign and Thutmose's records of his campaigns.
Certainly. So this is a picture of Thutmose III, or actually a statue, a photo of a statue that he made of himself. We aren't the first to identify him as Shishak. Velikovsky was the first, and then David Down, Dr. I think it's John Osgood. There's several other revisionist and Christian historians who believe that Thutmose was Shishak. Shishak means robber, so it wasn't. Shishak was not his Egyptian name, it was the Hebrew, the Bible basically calling him the guy who stole everything in the temple. We have a couple of records chronologically that make it almost certain to us that it has to be him. And I'm going to scroll down a little bit. Here we go. So in this chart, we talked in an earlier episode about the early, middle, and late Hyksos periods, where we viewed the early Hyksos as basically applying to both the Edomites descended from Esau and the Israelites descended from Jacob, and that this is the sojourn in Egypt. So the Hyksos came down to Egypt and they brought a lot of things, such as horses and chariots and curved swords that they got in contact with the Akkadians. And then after the Exodus, you had the Israelites leaving and the Amalekites, who were a Edomite tribe, invading Egypt, and they ruled over Egypt for about for 428 years until the first king of the 18th dynasty, Ahmose the First, he expelled the last of the Hyksos and killed their king in 428 years later. And we had that duration from the dynasties 16 through 17 added together, and a couple other ways to confirm it. And that also matches the Bible chronology from the Exodus to basically King Saul and his battle with the Amalekites. So then in Josephus, we have two more durations to the final defeat of the Hyksos, and that is 511 years and 518 years, which he gives as being from the first arrival of the Hyksos until the time of Thutmose. He calls him Thutmose. And we find that those two durations, so the 511-year duration comes to the year 979 or 980, which would be while Solomon is still alive. maybe 4 years before he died. And then the second one, 518 years, that comes to the year 5 of Rehoboam in 972 BC. So we believe that the propaganda of Thutmose, he's basically calling the Israelite kingdoms the Hyksos. So he viewed it as his ancestor, Amos I, expelled the Hyksos from Egypt, but he finished the job and he defeated the Hyksos in Canaan. And that's what he did then was he broke up the big kingdom of Israel into 4 smaller kingdoms, which were Judah, Israel, Edom, and Moab. And also you had Gaza, and even it started fragmenting even further the more time went on after he died. So that comes to a precise time period in the chronology of the 18th dynasty. It matches very, very clearly. So that's why we say that that is who that was. Now, regarding Eva Danilius, I'm going to show you the problem she brought up was that in the description of the 511-year campaign, which was year 22 of Thutmose III, he says that they conquered the city Mikti, which sounds like Megiddo, and that the way they did it was they took this mountain pass that was like a goat trail, and they could only go one abreast, and it was a very steep descent on either side. And hang on, I'm going to change my screen share to Google Earth so I can show you. Unfortunately, this still has all the modern stuff, but we can still see the geography. So up here is Megiddo, where the pin is. Can you see that?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, okay. So Megiddo is just to the north of this ridge that is Mount Carmel. So here's the ridge that's Mount Carmel. I think Elijah's showdown with the priests of Baal happened up here somewhere. And this is not a very high ridge, and the 2 places that you cross it are very broad. Like, so here's one area where the main road crosses, and then there's another one to the south, and there's just Henry Breasted has had his assistant spend like 5 years looking for this goat trail, narrow defile that was so important to the narrative of the great defeat of Thutmose III defeating Megiddo, Mikti. And he couldn't find it. He said, just in this region, it just doesn't fit this geography. However, Eva Danelius published a paper, probably back in the 70s, where she argued that he's actually describing not Megiddo, but Jerusalem, the Holy of Holies, and the pass is the road to Aruna, which was the name of the temple. The temple was built on the field of Aruna. And specifically, this place called Beth Horon. Now, today, that's the city of Beth Horon. In Bible times, there was a lower and an upper Beth Horon. And Jerusalem sits up here on this ridge, right up here. And from the west, it has basically this mountain with all these gorges going down to the valley. And so you had cities, like fortified cities, at the entrances of these gorges. Apparently, using Danelius's theory, was Tutmos acted like he was going north. So he comes up here like he's going to go up north, and he'd done that before and had passed through there before with no problems. But then he snuck through this canyon, came up to the north of Jerusalem, and he totally took them by surprise. And that's her theory, and I think that's a reasonable theory for what happened. However, I think that it happened in the year 572, and so it would therefore be the year 30 campaign of Thutmose. Let me go back to my slides. Okay, so that's our theory on that, or really it's Eva Danelius's theory, and that's the best I can do for you.
Yeah. So could you just comment on that choice of Shoshank the First as Shishak by mainstream historians and archaeologists and the merits of that?
Yes. So there was a later king of the Dynasty 22 named Shoshank. In fact, it was a very popular name, and there were actually, I think, 7 kings by that name, kings and princes, if you count them both. And when Champollion, the French Egyptologist, I'm probably mispronouncing his name, when he found the evidence of the 22nd dynasty, and he read this annals of this campaign by Shoshank, where he said he went up into Canaan and he conquered all these cities, he saw the name Shishak as Shoshank. And once he saw that, he couldn't unsee it. And really, Bible archaeologists have followed it ever since. And so what they've done, they don't really have any other strong external synchronisms for Dynasty 22. So they peg Shoshank I, who had this campaign in the last 2 years of his life. Excuse me. They peg the 22nd dynasty to Solomon's, or sorry, Rehoboam's 4th year. And then they basically stretched the 22nd dynasty down to get down to the 25th dynasty, because we know that the 25th interacted with the 22nd and 23rd dynasties. So Kenneth Kitchen's third intermediate period is his masterpiece on the subject, probably 800 pages. But essentially, most of his book is he's justifying this placement of this dynasty in a way that makes it a lot longer than Manetho said. Manetho said the 22nd dynasty lasted 120 years, and I think Kitchen has it lasting almost 250 years. So the big thing that's missing, or I would say the big counter argument that they ignore, and all of them have ignored, is that in this inscription where Shoshank says, "I conquered Canaan and all these cities," he specifically says, "The god Amun gave me victory over the kingdom of Mitanni." And Mitanni was an Amorite, a Hurrian kingdom, which is very different from Israel. In fact, Mitanni was the enemies of Israel, we will argue. And here's a map of Mitanni. So in the previous episode, we talked about Shamshi-Adad, who said he conquered Ashur, but he built his capital up here. And they called the kingdom in Akkadian the kingdom of Upper Mesopotamia. But we think that he was basically the Hurrian king, Shaushtatar, who also conquered Ashur and carried off a golden door. It matches that Shamshi-Adad was the king of Mitanni. Mitanni, the Hurrians were basically the tribe that lived in this area, which we believe the Bible calls the Syrians across the river, when talking about David and Hadadezer. And Mitanni, they seem to be based up here in this upper Tigris River. They had an ancestor they called Mita. It looks to us like they are probably the Medes, the original ancient Medes, and that they were allies or overlords of the Hurrians. And so they formed this empire, but it wasn't an empire like the Roman Empire or the Babylonian Empire. It was very much of a loose confederation. So you have a high king and a bunch of low kings. So one of the kingdoms, actually, I'm going to show you another slide here in a minute. So we'll get to that in a minute. Well, all I will say is that Shoshank defeated the kingdom of Mitanni, and we believe that is a famous battle that's recorded in the Assyrian annals around the year 796 BC, if I'm remembering it right, somewhere in there, 795, 796. We believe that Shoshank, Jeroboam II, and I believe it was Ashur-Nirari III of Assyria, they all basically worked together and finally put the last nail in the coffin of the kingdom of Mitanni. Now, interestingly, in an ancient Near Eastern text, when Dr. Pritchard, who is the editor, on the section about Shoshank's claim to have defeated Mitanni, he said, how quaint, the kingdom of Mitanni had gone extinct 300 years earlier. And my question would be, who do you think knows who Shoshank's enemy was? Shoshank himself or an ancient Near Eastern studies professor 3,000 years later? I'll put my bet on Shoshank knowing exactly who his enemy was. So that's our point on that. The second point I wanted to bring related to that. Yes, okay. And this will come in the episode that we do on the Dynasty 22nd, the 22nd and 23rd dynasties. There's a synchronism that Ashurbanipal of Assyria recorded that a Petubasti was one of the governors that his father had installed in Egypt I think in the year 571 or five. I'm sorry, 671 or 670. His father invaded Egypt, and he installed these governors over cities, one of whom was Petubast, who paid tribute to Ashurbanipal, and I think the year 666. And then when there was a rebellion against him, Ashurbanipal took this Petubast along with the others back to Assyria, put them on trial, and he killed them all except for two, who were Psammetichus and his father Necho. And he sends them back to Egypt and he makes Necho the actual high king of Egypt, and he makes Psammetichus a king of Lower Egypt. So there's this synchronism to a Petubast, and unlike Shoshank, where there's 7 of them, Petubast is such an uncommon name. There's only 2, and the previous one was recorded in the campaign of an Ethiopian emperor named Pianki, that he encountered a Petubast, but it's a Petubast of a different city than the 23rd dynasty. So we simply use the synchronism that Ashurbanipal gave us, that Petubast was the Petubast of Dynasty 23, and we know the year that he died because that was the year that Ashurbanipal executed him. And if you use that synchronism, the whole thing just snaps together. That these Dynasty 22 and 23 are linked together, and they fit known battles. Shoshank's battle fits with the defeat of Damascus. At any rate, that's for a future episode, so I won't go too much further into it, but I will simply say we have a much better fit for Shoshank than Campbellian and Kitchen, in our opinion.
Thank you. So next I want to move to the Amarna period. So we've talked about this a bit in previous episodes, but for those who didn't see those or perhaps don't remember, and you can correct me if I'm summarizing incorrectly, this archive is from a city which was built as the new capital of Egypt by the Pharaoh Akhenaten of the 18th dynasty. Akhenaten was that pharaoh who initiated a religious revolution in Egypt, which took them away from their traditional gods and towards the worship of the Aten. In this archive, you've got correspondence between Egyptian officials and lots of officials in Canaan, the Near East, and Mesopotamia. This obviously has major implications for our chronology of the ancient world. Would you just summarize Velikovsky's theory of the Amarna period, and perhaps, or we can get into this in a bit, where you differ with Velikovsky on this?
Okay. Well, here's a map of the general area of the Middle East, the kingdoms that were corresponding with Akhenaten, and ours is a bit different from if you go on Wikipedia or some other encyclopedia, they will show Amurru as being up here. And so we believe this is about what it looked like when Solomon died. Damascus was the kingdom of Amurru, or the Arameans, really, is what they are. The Hittites start taking this area of what was Yamhad, and they gradually encroach on that until they completely conquered it. I believe around the time of Shalmaneser III, which would be 850, roughly 851 BC. The kingdom of Mitanni I have outlined in this yellow, and the reason I have it outlined this way and then little subsections is that's kind of how they were organized. Is you had little kinglets, and then you have this this empire effectively, which has a high king, and the capital of Washukani, they're not really sure where it is. They think it's on the Upper Tigris. It could be in this area. Some people think that it's the city of Rusa on Lake Van. At any rate, so this yellow outline is roughly the kingdom of Mitanni. We believe that what happened was the king of Mitanni, the emperor, his name is Shatarna II at the time of Asa, King Asa of Judah. And you have this king, I think it was Basha, might have been a different one. This king of Israel is attacking Jerusalem. He's preparing to invade the kingdom of Judah. And so Asa sends a gift, and we put this around 930 BC. He sends a gift to a king of Damascus named Ben-Hadad in the Bible. He pays Ben-Hadad to attack um, the Israelites, and which he does. And the Bible says he took Dan and two other cities. The two cities that he names appear to be right here, just north of this is the Sea of Galilee, the foot of Mount Hermon. And so it says, then the king of Israel stopped preparing to invade Judah, and he went back to and fortified his capital, Tirzah, which is up here just south of the Sea of Galilee. The question would be timing wise, if Dan was Qatna, as we argue, and you recall last episode, we said this is a very dangerous defensive position for Israel, because if the king of Damascus decides to cut off this belt to the sea, he cuts the kingdom in half. And that's exactly what happened when Ben-Hadad started attacking. So we think that what happened was there was some back and forth, there were some raids, but ultimately we think that Ahab was able to maintain control of this upper area off and on until he died, and then Jehoahaz died. And by the time of Rib-Adi, Rib-Adi is who Lisa Leal identified as um, Jehoram of Israel, or Jehoram the Elder is what Rib-Adi means. And there we go. What happened by the time of Rib-Adi, you have the Amorites had conquered all the way. They conquered the Becca Valley where Baalbek is. They conquered Qatna. And they even conquered all the way down to Ramoth Gilead, where both Ahab and then later Jehoram and I think Ahaziah of Judah, they fought against Hazael later until they were defeated. And then even later in the Bible, you learn that the king of Damascus, Hazael, he had gotten all the way down to threaten Jerusalem. So over a period of about 50 years, this got bigger and bigger and took more and more territory. So I just realized I departed from the question, which was, what is Velikovsky's theory? So Velikovsky's theory is very interesting, and I think his book Oedipus and Akhenaten is his magnum opus. It was wonderfully done. It was a pleasure to read. If such a book can be a pleasure to read, it really was. His theory is, if you look at the Greek legend of Oedipus, which was written, I guess the plays were written around 100 years after Akhenaten lived, according to our chronology. They say it occurred in Thebes, and Akhenaten's capital was Thebes. They say that this baby was born named Oedipus, and Oedipus means swollen legs or swollen feet. And he was basically, the oracle gave him a bad, said that he would kill his father. So they exposed him, meaning he was given to a shepherd and told to be left out in the wilderness to die, which was apparently a pretty common way of dealing with deformed babies in ancient times. But the shepherd ends up giving him to someone else, and he ends up getting taken to another kingdom and raised as a prince there. And then this is the Greek myth. And then he comes back and he meets his father on the road, not knowing he's his father, and they get in a quarrel and he kills him. And then he comes to Thebes, and the queen is now a widow, and he does something. I think he kills a sphinx or something. He does something to save the people of the city, and so they make him king, and he marries the queen, who is his own mother. And they have two sons and some daughters. I'm not sure. Well, anyway, they have two sons, and at some point he realizes that he married his own mother, and so he puts his eyes out and he becomes a wandering beggar. And then his two sons have an arrangement where they agree to where one will be king for a year and then the other will be king for a year. And basically, he says their grandfather, who was the father of their mother, he is kind of manipulating them, and they get into a war with each other, and both of them die. And the grandfather he favored the younger son, and so he orders that the older son may not receive a proper burial. But the wife of the older son, she gives him a proper burial anyway. And when it's found out, the grandfather, who's now the king, he orders that she be sentenced to a life between the dead and the living. And so they dig a hole for her and put a cage over top of it, and they basically make her live in a hole in the cemetery. And after some time, I think there's another son who wants to marry her, and they finally convince the king to let her out, but they go and they find that she hanged herself. And so that's the tragedy of Oedipus. Well, Velikovsky pointed out that Akhenaten, a lot of these things appear to be true of him. Specifically, even he had this bizarre, body shape. He looks like he's the result of a lot of years of inbreeding, and that's what the Egyptians were doing. They kept marrying their sisters. The pharaoh would marry their sister, and to have the throne, it was the daughter of the pharaoh who basically carried the royal blood. And so to get the throne, the next generation, his sons would have to marry their sister to have their claim to the throne. And Akhenaten just his health is a wreck. And then if you look at the mummies of Tutankhamun and Smenkheri, they also look like they had horrible genetics. Velikovsky theorized that he had a condition called lipotrophy, where the lower body has excess fat and the upper body has basically almost no fat at all. And he points out that Akhenaten has a number of inscriptions where he said he was not expected to live, but he lived long. Well, as far as we know, according to the conventional history, he only reigned for 18 years, and he doesn't seem to have been over 38 when he died. That's not exactly living long. But if he had been condemned to be exposed as a child and he survived and comes back and becomes king, then these inscriptions of Akhenaten who lived long, they actually make sense. They could make sense. So, and Velikovsky's theory is that a lot of the stuff from Oedipus was taken from Akhenaten, although I think it's pretty obvious that he didn't kill his father. But I suspect that what could have happened was the oracle of Amun did tell the father that the child was unlucky or bad, and they exposed him, and that he did manage to come back. And he might have come back even in the reign of Amenhotep III, who I believe I have up here. That's Amenhotep III, very healthy looking guy, his father. And that maybe Amenhotep III started turning against the oracle of Amun, the temple of Amun, and the priests of Amun, because they had given this basically bad oracle about his son who did survive and came back. So Amenhotep III, he started the worship of Aten, which is the competing god in Egypt, a solar deity. I think up here I have a picture. So in the Egyptian religion, Aten is the sun, but specifically you see the rays of the sun have these little hands reaching down. And this is Akhenaten and this is Nefertiti, and you can see again it shows his weird, fatty legs and belly and skinny upper body. And this was extremely unusual. Egyptians were usually portrayed like in a very idealistic, bodybuilder looking, low body fat. And yet he is basically displaying his afflictions to the world. And I think it's probably because he's showing I was condemned to die, but I'm coming back and I'm showing everyone that I lived, I overcame it. So at any rate, that would be Velikovsky's theory as to why Akhenaten turned against the priests of Amun and shut down the temple of Amun. He thinks basically that he blamed them for his being exposed as a child, and therefore that's why he did what he did. So that's I should say that Velikovsky has a lot more to it than that. So he argues that these letters in the Amarna letters, Ribadi, he says, is Ahab. These are characters in the Amarna letters. And let me see if I can find that for you. Here we go. So these are our identifications, but Velikovsky says, where is Ribadi? He says Ribadi is Ahab. He said that this woman, Beilat Nisa, that she's the woman who basically took care of Elisha. Damian Mackey suggests that Labayu was Ahab, and Velikovsky identified Abdihiba as Jehoram of Judah. No, actually, he identified him as Jehoshaphat, I think. He identified Hazael as Aziru and also Shadiwaza in the Hittite treaties, and we actually agree with him on that. And he identified Ben-Hadad as a character named Tashrata and possibly also a character named Abdu Astrada, who is he's the king of Damascus, who Ribadi is just complaining about in all of his letters. So that's his explanation of the Amarna era, and I'll let you ask the next
So,
question.
so where do you think Velikovsky, to the extent that he did go wrong, where do you think he went wrong in these identifications, and why did he make the mistakes that he did?
I think he was a generation off. I'm going to see it. Oh, here we go. And this is actually part of, he inherited it from the larger Egyptology community. These letters, these letters name the king, but they name the king's throne name in Akkadian. And the throne names of some of these kings look very similar. They're like one consonant apart from each other. And sometimes it depends on the translation of the tablet. And we suspect, for example, the letters to Bernaberndiash and Ashur-uballit, they're currently believed to have been written to Amenhotep III and Akhenaten. We believe they were probably written to Tutmos IV and Amenhotep. So they're 30 or 40 years earlier. I think also the conventional scholars tend to assume that all of the eight Amarna letters were written while Akhenaten was king or the end of Amenhotep's reign. But if you are going to set up a new capital and you're a diplomat, you're moving your State Department to this new capital, you're going to bring all of your diplomatic correspondence with you because you never know when something's going to come up and you need to refer to the history, the correspondence, the treaty that your grandfather made with Amenhotep II or Tutmos the third, or if you're the Egyptian, the treaties that he made with these people. So I think that some of the EA letters that have been found are actually from this era, Amenhotep to Tutmos IV. The second issue is that Velikovsky seems to have I think that he made a mistake, and Lisa Leal has written a really good paper on this, where she makes the argument that Ribadi translates to basically Jehoram the elder, and she thinks he is Jehoram of Israel. She argues that Abdikiba is Jehoram of Judah, not Jehoshaphat, his father. So again, she's shifting it down by one generation. She disagrees with Damian Mackey, and she argues that Labayu is actually Mabayu, the Moabite, Misha of Moab, and that Beilat Nisa, she could be either Athaliah or Damian Mackey argues Jezebel, and I could see either one. She doesn't. We only have one letter from her, and she doesn't say enough to actually peg it to any particular history. And then here's where we would add to what they have to say. Actually, let me first point out, Leal also identifies Jehu as Yahweh, who in most published versions of the letters, it's translated as Yama, and she argues that it could be translated Yahweh. And she actually has a degree in archaeology and those languages, and she lives in Israel. So we would add to these, because we identified Qatna as Dan. We suspect that there's a king of Qatna and Nuhasi called Adu Narari. Now, Adu, as we talked about previously, it's a theophoric, and it's translated as Baal in the case of Ishbaal. And Leal shows a couple other cases where Adu means Baal. So Adu Narari would mean Baal is my helper. And if there's any king of Israel who would have been named Baal is my helper, I would think that that probably would be Ahab. He was the king who introduced Baal worship into Israel, and it was fanatical about it. Then there's a number of letters from an Akizi of Qatna, which we suspect is Ahaziah. So Ahaz turned into Akiz. He's Akizi. And this would be the last correspondence from Qatna before it fell to the Syrians. We haven't worked this out perfectly because some of these letters are thought to be written to Akhenaten, and we think that Akizi, if he was Jehoahaz, if he was Ahaziah, he would have been writing his letter about 5 years before Amenhotep III died, and he died before Amenhotep did, so he shouldn't be writing letters to Akhenaten. So we're not sure about that yet. We need to do more research and nail it down. But I want to say that using Lisa Leal's modification, we can see how this could possibly make sense. Currently, conventional scholars say that Rib Adi, or who Leal says was Jehoram, he's writing most of his letters from Byblos, and he identifies himself as the governor of Gubla. Uh, Gubla was the name of Byblos. And he says he has another city called Sumara. And Velikovsky argued that was Samaria. And conventional scholars say no, that was the city Zamara on the coastline just to the north. And what we find is there's another letter where some kings are plotting to meet together in the Beth Shulman, the temple in Jerusalem, before attacking Samara. And if Samara was Zamara and Beth Shulman is down here, why would you meet to prepare your attack 200 miles south of the city that you're going to attack? Whereas if Samara was Samaria, this is only about 30 miles away. This would be in Jerusalem was under Judah. Judah was at the time an enemy of Samaria. And so this would be a safe place to meet and make your plans before you got your armies and then you went and did the attack. So after Ben-Hadad starts conquering this territory, the Bible says he took Dan, which we think is Qatna, and these cities down here by Mount Carmel. So if he basically went halfway to the sea, and we think this is why Ribadi, he's not saying he's king of Qatna, he's saying he's governor of Gubla. And there are two reasons for this. He could have said, I'm king of Samaria or Sumer, and he mentions Sumer quite a bit. But if you're writing to the Egyptian king, the governor, an Egyptian governor over these territories is viewed as a higher office than a king of a city. So he's calling himself governor of Byblos because that is his highest rank. And if he was Jehoram of Israel, who was his mother? Jezebel. Well, where did Jezebel come from? She's the daughter of a king of, I think it was either Sidon or Tyre. She's a daughter of a Canaanite king. And so it's very possible that he might have had some family land. He might have had some family connections that enabled him to become king of Byblos as well as Samaria. At any rate, we think that the letters that he writes, they make probably more sense with Sumer being Samaria than they do with Sumer being Zamara. Another identification that Velikovsky made that we actually agree with. So we mentioned Mitanni. We don't have any pictures of the kings of Mitanni, but there's a king of Mitanni called Tushratta, and he writes a number of letters to Akhenaten. There's another king of Damascus who this king is complaining about called Abdu Ashurta. And he is acting very sneaky. He's pretending to be loyal to Egypt, but he is secretly using these groups called the Habiru, who are basically rural gangs, to overthrow cities and take territory in this area. We think that what probably was going on here is that Shatarna II he's the high king of Mitanni. And these high kings of Mitanni had many wives like Solomon did. And so they've got lots of sons, and they put their sons on these little cities as kings. So you've got a son of Shatarna as king of Damascus, called Apu in the letters, and Amuru as the kingdom. And the Bible calls him Ben-Hadad, but his name that he uses in the correspondence is Abdu Ashurta, which means servant of Ishtar. In his letters to Amenhotep III, he's extremely obsequious. He's like, I bow 7 times before you on the front and 7 times on the back. And he's basically, it's embarrassing to read them, frankly. He is so obsequious. But then when the letters to his son start appearing, these letters from Tushratta is extremely confident. He's calling himself brother. He wants to arrange a marriage of his daughter. to the king of Egypt, Amenhotep, and then to his son Akhenaten. And so if you read the letters, you think Abdu Ashurta cannot possibly be the same person as Tushratta because their personalities are completely different in the way that they write letters. We suspect still that they are the same person and that the letters from Abdu Ashurta are from earlier, while his father Shatarna too is still the basically emperor of Mitanni. I think that he died. It was either year 18 or year 30 of Amenhotep III. So his son is basically Abdu Ashurta he's a petty king, and he's afraid of Egypt. He's also doesn't want to get in trouble with his father, so he's acting sneaky. And he probably had a local scribe from this culture, and he uses a lot of local idioms that we see in the Bible. Like he keeps saying, "Am I a dog that I would do this?" or "Am I a dog that I would do that?" And the Bible actually quotes Ben-Hadad as saying almost exactly that. Um, and then we think what happened was Shatarna died maybe 5 years before Amenhotep died, and Abdu Ashurta got promoted to Tushratta, and Tushratta is almost the same name as Abdu Ashurta, Abdushratta, and we think that he moved to his whatever the capital of Mitanni was. It's believed to be a city called Washukani, but no one knows exactly where it is. Hasn't been found yet. So now he's the High King, and now I think he got a new scribe. His new scribe is more fluent in Hurrian, which is the language they speak in this area all across the river. And now he views himself as the equal of the king of Egypt. And so the change in tone is due to him being promoted, and also due to him getting a new set of scribes who, I guess you might say, were more professional. That's currently our hypothesis, our working hypothesis. It may just turn out that Abdi Ashurta was not the same person as Tushratta. But we can say that Ben-Hadad, Abdi Ashurta, and Tushratta, they have all three something in common. All three died in Damascus. All three were murdered, and all three it was not clear who was the murderer. And then we know that Tushratta was succeeded by a guy named Shati Waza. That's from the Hittite treaty, and the Hittites, in their language, they couldn't say certain sounds, and so we think Shati Waza. Waza was Hazael. That's how they said Hazael. And in the Amarna letters, you have these letters to a guy named Aziru. And Aziru, we think, is also Hazael, but that's more in the local dialect. And so after Tushratta dies, he is succeeded by Shati Waza. After Abdi Ashurta dies, he is succeeded by Aziru. And we think it fits together that they are the same people. And not only are this the same people, but we're able to triangulate with durations that the death of Tushratta appears to have been, I think, 2 years before that Jehu rose up and began killing all the sons of Ahab. So 887 BC was when Tushratta died or was murdered. And then Hazael, it took him basically a year or two to get control of the throne, and the Hittite king helped him. So the Hittite king, Shadiwaza flees to the Hittite king and says his brother is the one who killed Tushratta. And the Hittite king says, "Okay, I believe you, and here's my daughter as a wife. I'm going to help you get on the throne." And so he takes an army and he defeats Mitanni. He goes over to Washukani, and he basically puts Shadiwaza on the throne and puts his son on the throne of Carchemish. So that's where the Hittites start taking big chunks out of these previous, I guess, power arrangement here. Okay, so that's basically our position on it. And it's still a work in progress, other than that particular synchronism of the death of Tushratta. I don't think that we've come to a final conclusion on the identities in the EA letters. That's kind of where we're at.
Okay. So there's one suggestion, I think, from Velikovsky that I find particularly interesting, and that's Velikovsky's argument that the Temple of Solomon is actually mentioned in the Amarna archive. Would you just explain what's going on there?
Absolutely. let's see. Okay, I had the number, I misplaced it. So in a couple of the EA letters, there's a mention of the city of Jerusalem as Jerusalem. And then in one of them, it mentions, I think Rebadi was complaining that these kings were meeting together in Bit Sholman at Jerusalem to plan their attack on Sumerah, which is Samaria. And so that that is very obviously Bit Shilman means house of Solomon. Bit means Beth means house in Hebrew. Um, well, you couldn't have a reference to the house of Solomon as a temple until after Solomon had built the temple. Even before David, Jerusalem wasn't called Jerusalem. It was called either Salem or Jebus because the Jebusites lived there. So the fact that the EA letters mention both Jerusalem and Bit Shilman is a very strong proof that they have to be after the time of Solomon. They have to be the divided kingdom era. And I don't see how, mainstream scholars, they just only get around it by ignoring it. Or they can say, well, maybe Bit Shilman was a tradition before, and Solomon just named it, the same thing. But that doesn't really make a lot of sense.
So you've also identified Rib Adi with Jehoram of Judah, whereas Velikovsky identified him with Jehoshaphat. And we've explored some of the chronological reasons for that disagreement. But do you have anything else to add on, why Jehoram's reign fits the information about Rib Adi better than Velikovsky's identification of Jehoshaphat?
Yeah, the main reason is that he's alive when Tushratta dies. And Velikovsky said that Ribadi is Ahab and Tushratta is Ben-Hadad. But in the Bible, Ahab dies, I think about 8 years before Ben-Hadad dies. And Jehoram is king after Ahab. Well, actually, Ahaziah is king first, and he only lasts 2 years. And then Jehoram is king for almost 12 years.
Oh, sorry. I think
And
I said accidentally, just to correct. I think I said Jehoram of Judah, whereas we're actually talking Jehoram of Israel here when we say Ribadi.
yeah, Jehoram of Israel. So Velikovsky's arrangement contradicted the Bible, so that we have to reject it for that reason. But if we recognize Lisa Leal's hypothesis that Ribadi is Jehoram the elder of Israel, it actually fits perfectly because he outlives both Tushratta and Amenhotep. So a lot of his letters are to Akhenaten. His earlier letters are to Amenhotep. His later letters are to Akhenaten, and he also reports on the murder of Abdu-Shrata, which we would think was also Tushratta. So he's a witness to the murder of this king in Damascus, and then his son Aziru starting to become more of a problem than his dad was. So all of that would fit Jehoram, but we don't think that it's wise to absolutely stake our case on that, meaning that our chronology does not depend on Ribadi being Jehoram. Ribadi could have just been a king of Byblos and Zamara, and he effectively acts as a narrator because he wrote so many letters. He's telling us everything that's happening. So even if he wasn't Jehoram, he's extremely useful to illuminating what happened during this period of about 15 years. Um, so
Okay, so we talk about the identification. We've already talked a little bit about it, but the identity of Labayu. Labayu is one of those big figures in the Amarna letters. He's received some press in revisionist circles because David Roll has identified him, given his chronology with King Saul. Some conventional scholars have actually identified him with Abimelech. I know Damian Mackey has identified him as Ahab. What's your best assessment of the identity of Labayu?
okay, remember that one of the rules that of our actual set of papers, one of our I guess methodology rules is that you can't. We say that you can't use etymology first. You have to prove that someone lived at the same time first. Then you can use etymology to say that person A was actually person B. Um, we find that so with even with the bit Schulman reference, we're in the right time frame, so we could say that maybe these guys could be characters in the Bible. Whereas it looks to us like what Roll is doing is he's identifying like his identification of Saul and Mutbaal as the son of Saul. Mutbaal is the son of Labayu. He's using that etymological connection as his anchor to then move the chronology, and we do it the other way around. We first prove the chronology, then we can do recognize possible identifications of the names because there's so many people with similar names in this area over over several centuries that you can go very very wrong and off course by making name associations such as Shishak equals Shoshank. They are so confident of that, and yet we are certain that it's about 200 years off. Okay, so the best argument I've seen is Lisa Leal, who she thinks that Labayu was mistranslated, or that it should actually be Mabayu, which would be the Moabite. Um, so she thinks that this is Misha of Moab, and we do know from the Bible description that he rebuilt Jericho. Or I think it was Damien Maggie argues that he's also Heel of Bethel, who rebuilt Jericho, which is another argument. Um, but we find that this Labayu is operating in this area of the Jordan Valley, and that his son writes a letter to the Pharaoh from Pella, which is a city right here about halfway between the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee, up in the mountains on the east bank. And actually, that's where in at the time of after the resurrection, at the time of the destruction of the temple in AD 70, the Christians fled to Pella. They fled from Jerusalem to Pella, and that's the same city that Mutbaal wrote a letter from centuries earlier. At any rate, Labayu fits the area of operation of Misha the Moabite, and he's associated with the giving land to the Habiru. And I suspect that he was basically acting as a vassal of Abdi Yeshurta. He's or an ally. And so he and Abdi Yeshurta are both helping the Habiru while claiming not to. The Habiru are these gangs, these roving gangs that are going out and threatening cities and then burning them down and robbing them.
So you don't think that Hibiru has any relationship to Hebrews in your
I
mind?
don't.
Okay.
I do not. Um, Obviously, some people have decided that, but I'll have to go back and look in the Bible how you don't see a lot of cases of Israelites ever calling themselves Hebrews. Um, but then you do see in the New Testament the book of Hebrews. So I'm not sure if that's even a name that was used in that time frame. But I'm not an expert on that particular question, so I don't want to weigh too heavily. But we know that all through there's also a guy named Adrimi who he was a king of Alalak, or his family was up here. Or I guess his dad was a king of Aleppo. It was called Yamhad, and they were overthrown, and he goes into exile. And he said, I lived with the Habiru in Canaan, and I lived with them for a number of years, and then he gains enough people in his gang, and he gets some ships, and they come back and they conquer Alalak, the city in this little valley over here. So we have a number of cases of Habiru meaning roving gangs, well, kind of like Jesse James and the Younger Brothers. That's what they meant by Habiru in the EA letters.
Okay. Um, so one other thing I wanted to talk about was, when you look at the revised chronology, which you've suggested, and you just look at what's going on in the northern kingdom of Israel at the time of Akhenaten, it's kind of striking that there's this religious revolution going on in Akhenaten's Egypt, and there's also a Baalist religious revolution going on in Ahab's Israel. So, in your mind, is there a relationship between these two religious revolutions? And if so, um, What is that relationship? And also, you see, as you have on the slide here, Nefertiti that plays an astonishingly prominent role that, at least superficially seems analogous to the role that Jezebel plays in the Northern Kingdom. So do you think there's a relationship here, or is this just a superficial kind of uh, connection?
I think, ideas are contagious, and in the Middle East, in the Levant at that time, there are three main competing religions are in the north, you've got the worship of Baal, the storm god, who's a solar deity. He's called Hadad in the Hurrian areas. Um, you've got the Israelite religion, the basically the temple religion of Yahweh. But that's very limited to outsiders. So you're not going to see Yahweh religion spreading to other countries, whereas you do see the Baal religion spreading. Um, and then the third thing you have is in Egypt, you have they had a lot of gods, but the Temple of Amun was the dominant, um, it, I guess, religion at the time. The priests of Amun were like effectively the ruling class, because before you could become pharaoh, the head of the army was the high priest of Amun. And we wouldn't think of having, a four-star general is the high priest of our national religion, but that's how the Egyptians were. So Damian Mackey had written some articles years ago arguing that Nefertiti and Jezebel were the same person. He thought that after Ahab got killed, because he thinks Ahab is Labayu. Labayu, in one of his letters to Akhenaten, says, "Would I not give you my wife if you asked me? Would I not plunge a bronze dagger into my heart?" And I think he was just using what's the word? He's just using rhetoric. He's hyperbole to say that I'm loyal and will obey the king. But Mackey kind of argued that maybe this has actually happened after he had got killed. Maybe Akhenaten wanted his wife, and so that Jezebel goes down to Egypt, and she's called Nefertiti there. And he has this whole argument that she was there for a number of years and then comes back and Jehu kills her. I think that I actually was very enamored with that idea for a long time. But then when I started nailing down the chronology, because you got to do chronology first before you can do etymological identifications. And we find that Jehu killed Jezebel around the fourth or fifth year of Akhenaten. And we know that Nefertiti was the co-regent with Akhenaten for at least 18 years. And then she appears to have ruled under the name Nefer Nuaten herself for about 4 to 8 years. And so there's too many years of Nefertiti in Egypt for her possibly to have been Jezebel. So we reject the idea that they were the same person. But what we do find in common is in both religions, they're both solar religions where you're worshiping the sun god. They're both religions where you have the sun god as a wife. I guess in Baal worship, her name is Astarte or Asherah, as the Bible calls her. And in Egyptian religion, I don't know what their name was for the wife of Aten. But at any rate, the king in both kingdoms, Israel and also Egypt, the queen ends up acting as the high priestess of that religion. And she's effectively a fertility goddess. So Jezebel is basically a high priestess for the fertility goddess Astarte. And Nefertiti was very clearly acting as the high priestess of the fertility goddess associated with Aten. And the interesting thing about Nefertiti was that if you're going to be a fertility goddess, you got to have sons, because while daughters were valued as well, the sons were the strength of the right hand, and the king needs a son for the line to continue. And Nefertiti had 6 daughters. I think six, maybe four to six daughters and no sons. So as a fertility goddess, she was a total failure because she couldn't have any sons. So anyway, I think that the religions are related. That some people think that Akhenaten got his ideas from the kingdom of Mitanni, and I think Damian Mackey suggests that he had spent his childhood when he was in exile in Mitanni. And I wouldn't be surprised. I think that's possible. But I don't think that it's strong enough of a connection for us to say, yes, this is what happened.
Okay. So one last thing. Um, there's an individual in the Amarna letters named Akizi of Qatna. Could you tell us a little bit about this person, how you identify him, and what the implications of that identification are for your overall model?
Okay. So Akizi sends 6 letters. If it's the same person, there could be possibly 2 different Akizis. Um, in these letters to Akhenaten, he's the first 4. He's just reporting the conditions in the far north. Go back to my map. Find my map. Okay, so he's reporting to Amenhotep. His first letters are to Amenhotep. The conditions in the far north of what the Hittites are doing and what the Amorites are doing. Um, then his last 2 letters, if they're the same person, they could be a different later king. They're assumed to be to Akhenaten, and I'm not sure that's true. As I mentioned before, if Akizi was Ahaziah of Israel, I don't think his last 2 letters would be to Akhenaten. So it could be a later king of Israel, such as Jehoahaz, who also has the Ahaz name, part of the name. But what's really interesting about it is Velikovsky had argued that when Tutmos helped break up Israel, he is the one that gave Jeroboam the idea of building these golden calf temples, one in the north and one down in Samaria, to make sure that the Israelites stayed under his thumb instead of going to Jerusalem to worship the God there, the God Jehovah. And so we had this letter from Akizi where he's telling Akhenaten, it's really sad that the Hittite king came and he conquered Qatna. And he took our idol, the idol that your ancestor gave us, the idol of Samiji. And Samiji seems to be a nickname. And he said, we think that Samiji is a god of good luck, and you'll really be blessed if you send us a sack of gold so we can make a new idol to Samiji. And of course, the Bible tells us that even specifically of Jehoahaz, it says that he continued in the way of his fathers of the sin of Jeroboam of Nebat. And what was the sin of Jeroboam of Nebat was that he was worshiping the golden calf idols, and causing Israel to worship the golden calf idol. So I'm not sure at this point which whether Akizi, who wrote that letter, was the later Jehoahaz or if he was the earlier Ahaziah of Israel. But either way, it shows us that what the Bible reported was very literally true, that they were worshiping these idols, and when the idol got stolen, he writes a letter to Egypt asking for more gold to make a new one. So
Well, Well, thank you so much, Ken. And I know people have gotten a great deal out of these discussions. I really appreciate the amount of detail that we're able to go into in such a lengthy series of discussions. So I look forward to having you on next time, and we'll see you soon.
thank you, Seraphim. God be with you.